Okay, let's dive in. We're looking at a really specific, intense moment in American political life here, October 2025. It felt like a real pressure cooker kind of month.
It really did. You had these two huge forces just crashing into each other. On one hand, this massive wave of public protest, unlike anything seen before, and on the other, complete government gridlock in D.C.
That's the core tension, isn't it? And we really want to understand this through the lens of the No Kings protests. The sources describe them as, well, historic, aimed right at the Trump administration's policies, sure, but maybe more fundamentally at how they were using presidential power.
Exactly. The interpretation and the use of that authority, that seems to be the crux of it.
So our mission today in this deep dive is to get into the source material. We want to grasp the sheer scale of these rallies. I mean, the numbers the organizers claimed are just staggering.
hmm
And we need to look at the specific actions, the executive decisions that really sparked this level of opposition, the why behind it all.
Right. What pushed people out into the streets in such numbers?
And finally, what did this huge wave of activism actually mean? Especially with that government shutdown hanging over everything. How did those two crises interact?
And we've had a really interesting mix of sources to work with. We have the organizer statements, the political analysis giving us the numbers, the hard data.
Right.
But then we also have this great on-the-ground reporting capturing the feel, the atmosphere of the events, plus policy documents, critiques. Putting it all together really paints a picture of a country under some extraordinary strain.
Okay, so let's start with those numbers because they really jump out. The October 18th No Kings protest. What are the actual estimates we're talking about here?
Well, the organizers themselves, groups like Indivisible, were pretty consistent. Their estimate was more than 7 million people participating on that single day, October 18th, 2025.
7 million. I mean, just saying it sounds huge, almost unbelievable from a logistical standpoint. How do you even count that many people accurately? And, is there a risk for organizers if those numbers get questioned?
That's a really important question, and the sources do address it.
Hmm.
Verifying crowd sizes this large is, well, notoriously difficult.
Mm.
Organizers use a mix of methods, aerial photos, sometimes geofencing data from phones, trying to correlate with local police estimates, which can vary wildly.
Sure.
But the key thing the analysis points out is that even if you take more conservative estimates from independent groups or news outlets, they still put the number well above 5 million.
Yeah. So still massive.
Absolutely massive. The consensus across the board, really, is that whether it was 5, 6, 7 million, it was, without doubt, the largest single day of political protest against a sitting president, certainly in modern American history.
And it wasn't just like a D.C. thing or a New York City event, which you sometimes see with big marches.
No, not at all. That's what made it structurally different. It was incredibly widespread geographically. The sources list more than 2,700 separate locations across all 50 U.S. states, plus D.C. And there were even solidarity events internationally, London, Berlin, place like that. It felt like a genuinely national, even global American moment.
So the organizers calling it the largest single-day demonstration ever against a sitting president. That claim seems pretty well supported by the sheer geographic spread alone.
It does. It wasn't just a protest. The sources frame it as this sustained, almost overwhelming outpouring of opposition.
And it didn't come out of nowhere, right? This October event was actually the third big one in 2025. There was a buildup.
Yeah, absolutely. You can see the momentum growing through the year. It suggests a strategy maybe, but also just deepening frustration.
What were the earlier ones?
So back in April, there was the hands-off protest. That drew about 3 million people, roughly 1,300 events. Still huge, but, less than half of the October numbers.
Right.
Then in June, they had No Kings 1. That one really escalated, about 5 million people, maybe 2,100 events.
And that June rally had a particularly dark shadow over it, didn't it?
It did. The sources make a point of noting the timing. That rally happened on the very same day that Minnesota State Representative Melissa Hortman and her husband Mark were assassinated. And many participants felt that tragedy really raised the stakes. It wasn't just about policy disagreement anymore. It felt, for some, like it was about fundamental safety and the political climate becoming dangerous.
So by October, when the numbers swelled past 7 million, the central message had really solidified. It was this very simple, powerful idea.
Incredibly powerful and very deliberately chosen. The unifying theme, you see it everywhere in the reports, was America has no kings and the power belongs to the people.
Harkening back to the founding.
Exactly. It tapped into that 250-year-old American idea. We don't do kings here.
Ooh.
And that simplicity, that historical resonance, allowed a really diverse group of people to rally behind it.
Let's talk about that diversity,
Yes.
because the administration line and their allies was very much trying to paint this as, just radical leftists, maybe some coastal elites having a tantrum.
Right, the standard dismissal playbook.
Yeah.
But the sources, particularly from the organizers and independent reporting, really push back on that. They emphasize how broad the coalition was.
So who was there?
Well, yes, obviously, Democrats, liberals, the people you'd expect. But organizers made a real point of highlighting the presence of anti-Trump Republicans, even some former Trump voters who felt disillusioned.
Interesting.
And crucially, significant participation from people in rural areas in so-called Trump country. The message was clear. This wasn't a partisan issue. It was about fundamental American principles. They wanted to show you were in, quote, good company, regardless of your usual political affiliation.
Which brings us to the tone of these events. Because with 7 million people, high tensions, a government shutdown, you might expect chaos.
But the sources consistently describe the rallies as overwhelmingly peaceful, joyful, even nonviolent.
That phrase kept coming up. A carnival, not carnage.
A carnival, not carnage. That sounds very deliberate.
It absolutely was. Politically strategic. Remember, Republican leaders, the administration, they had spent weeks warning that these would be hate America rallies, that they'd be full of Marxists, Antifa, anarchists, predicting violence.
Setting the stage for a crackdown, perhaps. Possibly. Or at least to discredit the protesters afterwards. But by maintaining this atmosphere of, well, joy and definitely nonviolence, the organizers effectively neutralized that entire narrative. They took away the justification for any kind of heavy-handed response.
It's like that old saying, kill them with kindness. Or in this case, kill the narrative with banjos and inflatable costumes.
Pretty much. And the sources back this up with hard data. Look at New York City estimates of around 100,000 marchers. And the NYPD reported 0 protest-related arrests.
For a crowd that size in Manhattan, that's genuinely remarkable.
It really is. It speaks to the discipline of the movement, the focus on the message constitutional assertion rather than seeking confrontation, and that joyful, sometimes irreverent tone. That's where the whole thing becomes visually memorable, too.
Yeah, the descriptions are great. You have families out with kids, people bringing their dogs. Apparently, the annual Halloween dog parade in Manhattan happened right alongside the march.
Just adding to the surreal, peaceful atmosphere.
Grandma's playing banjos. And the signs, they ranged from the really serious to the completely outrageous.
That reflects the coalition, doesn't it?
Yeah.
You'd have someone with a very profound Walt Whitman quote about democracy, standing next to someone with a sign using, let's say, very colorful language aimed at a specific policy or official.
Reaching different people in different ways.
Exactly. High-minded principle and gut-level frustration side by side.
And the inflatable costumes. I saw mentions of starfish, unicorns, even a pickle. What's the story with the giant inflatable pickle?
Okay, so the inflatable costumes, according to the reporting, were actually a specific form of political mockery. They started popping up as a direct response to administration rhetoric.
How so?
Remember the claims that cities like Portland, especially after earlier protests against ICE, were supposedly war-torn zones, needing federal intervention, needing the National Guard.
Right, that narrative of urban chaos.
So, showing up to a peaceful protest, dressed as a giant, inflatable, slightly ridiculous unicorn, or starfish, or, yes, even a pickle. It's a visual gag. It's saying, does this look like a war zone to you? It's using humor and absurdity to directly undercut the administration's justification for militarizing responses to dissent.
That's actually brilliant. Protest through silliness.
And it worked, visually. It made the administration's claims look even more out of touch.
And looking at different regions shows how this No Kings banner adapted to local cultures. You contrast somewhere like Northfield, Minnesota with Portland, Oregon. It's night and day.
It really is a fascinating contrast. So Northfield, Minnesota, generally seen as a more traditional, maybe center-leaning part of the Midwest. They had over 1,000 people gather in Ames Park.
And the tone there.
Very patriotic, according to the local reports. They sang the Star-Spangled Banner, recited the Pledge of Allegiance. The speeches focused heavily on the First Amendment, on constitutional rights. A local minister, Reverend Sarah Smalley, was quoted emphasizing joy as the strategic antidote to feeling overwhelmed by politics and community as the antidote to authoritarianism. Very grounded, very traditional.
Okay, now pivot to Portland, Oregon.
Portland hosted an emergency naked bike ride.
A naked bike ride in October in Oregon.
In 53-degree weather, apparently, when they started. Reports say about 1,000 people started the ride. but it grew to several thousand as they cycled, heading towards the local ICE facility.
What was the point of, well, the nakedness?
The sources quote organizers saying it was about showing vulnerability, a statement against the perceived militarization, the presence of federal agents, the ICE detentions. It was a way of saying, we are peaceful, we are exposed, we are not a threat, literally putting their vulnerable bodies on the line.
Wow. So from the Pledge of Allegiance in Minnesota to a naked bike ride protesting ICE in Portland, all under the same No Kings banner.
It shows the incredible breadth of the movement, doesn't it? That single idea resonated across vastly different cultural and political expressions. That was its power. But, maybe also a hint of the challenges in keeping such a diverse coalition unified long term.
Okay, so we've established the scale, 7 million people, coast to coast, unified by No Kings. That kind of reaction doesn't just happen, it needs fuel. What specific administration actions were people pointing to? What was the why behind this massive turnout?
Well, the sources consistently point to a perceived pattern of abusing executive power and undermining checks and balances. The single biggest flashpoint, mentioned again and again, was President Trump's repeated public threats to invoke the Insurrection Act of 1792.
Right, the Insurrection Act. Maybe we should quickly clarify what that actually is and, importantly, how Trump was describing his power under it.
Good idea. So the Insurrection Act is an old set of laws. Basically allows the president, under specific extreme circumstances like rebellion or states being unable to maintain order, to deploy the U.S. military or federalize National Guard troops domestically for law enforcement. It bypasses the usual restrictions on military involvement inside the U.S.
But it's meant for genuine emergencies.
Exactly. Very high bar. But the issue wasn't just the threat to use it, it was how Trump characterized the power it gave him. The sources quote him claiming it gave him unquestioned power.
Unquestioned power. That sounds regal.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And he also claimed invoking it would make court cases go away.
Which is not how it works.
Not at all. Legal analysts and the sources were very clear. The Insurrection Act, while a significant power, absolutely does not grant unquestioned authority. It doesn't suspend the Constitution. It certainly doesn't make court cases disappear or override the judiciary.
So the protesters saw that rhetoric claiming unchecked power, power over the courts, as the very definition of the kingship they were opposing.
Exactly. It felt like a direct assault on the rule of law itself. That was probably the single biggest driver mentioned.
Beyond the military threat, there was also this pattern of undermining oversight, wasn't there? The firings of the inspectors general, the so-called Friday night purge.
Yes, that was another major theme.
Right.
Inspectors general, the IGs, are crucial. They're supposed to be independent watchdogs within government agencies, rooting out waste, fraud, abuse. They're an internal check.
And firing several of them, often late on a Friday, to, what, bury the news?
That was the perception, yeah. It was widely seen, according to the political analysis we looked at, as a deliberate move to weaken accountability, to remove those internal checks, and allow the administration to operate with less scrutiny.
And the interference went beyond IGs, right? They even tried to meddle with the Federal Reserve.
They did. There were attempts to fire Federal Reserve officials. Now, the Fed's independence from political pressure is considered absolutely vital for economic stability.
You don't want presidents messing with interest rates for political gain.
Exactly. The fact that the courts actually had to step in to block those moves and stabilize the markets, it just reinforced this narrative that the executive branch was willing to politicize everything, even institutions meant to be completely nonpartisan.
And we mentioned the shutdown earlier. We'll get into that more. But the administration was apparently using the shutdown itself as a weapon.
That's a key piece of context. During the shutdown, the administration issued orders to make cuts to the federal workforce and suspend certain domestic spending programs, but targeted specifically at Democratic states and cities.
So using the power of the purse, or lack thereof, to punish political opponents.
Precisely. It blurred the line between governing the country and ruling over perceived enemies. It felt punitive, not administrative.
Then there were the pardons and commutations. The one that got a lot of attention, even in late-night comedy monologues, was the commutation for former Congressman George Santos.
Ah, yes. George Santos. Convicted of serious fraud, identity theft, expelled from Congress by a huge bipartisan majority. And then his prison sentence is commuted by the president right before these massive protests.
The timing seems pointed.
The analysis certainly framed it that way. Less about justice or mercy, more about rewarding loyalty, perhaps signaling to others that the president protects his allies no matter what. It fed directly into that different rules for the powerful critique, that sense of unchecked favoritism, again, very king-like in the eyes of the protesters.
And the Vice President J.D. Vance also added fuel to the fire around that time.
He did. There was a controversy involving leaked chat messages from some young Republican activists, messages containing racist and anti-Semitic content.
Okay.
And Vice President Vance's public defense was essentially, kids do stupid things.
Oof, that sounds like minimizing serious hate speech.
That's exactly how it was received by critics and protesters.
Ah.
At a time when the No Kings movement was trying to rally around core American values of equality and constitutional rights, the VP seemingly downplaying racism and anti-Semitism felt, to many, like it showed a deeper disregard for those principles within the administration.
Shifting focus a bit to foreign policy and the economy, how did the administration's actions there contribute to the dissent? One source described the approach to international agreements as like dealing with IKEA furniture.
Yeah, that's a great analogy, meaning, complex, maybe requires careful assembly following instructions, but instead, you just sort of toss the instructions and hope it holds together.
Leading to instability.
That was the consistent critique, deliberately creating instability. The sources point to things like delaying crucial military aid to Ukraine, which analysts argued directly helped Russia and made the situation there worse.
And economically, the tariffs.
Big issue. The administration imposed broad tariffs on goods from major trading partners, China, India, but also allies like Canada and the EU.
With consequences back home.
Absolutely. The reports detailed American farmers, often a Republican-leaning group, losing key export markets, literally having to dump crops they couldn't sell.
Wow.
And at the same time, American consumers were paying higher prices for imported goods because of those tariffs. So the argument was that these policies were causing tangible economic pain domestically, disrupting global stability, maybe for political show rather than sound economic strategy.
And perhaps the most striking example of, let's say, questionable priorities cited in the sources was a military action taken during the shutdown.
Yes, ordering military strikes on Venezuelan vessels while the U.S. government was shut down, while federal workers weren't getting paid, while domestic services were grinding to a halt.
That sends quite a message.
It really does.
Yeah.
Critics framed it as almost absurdly out of touch, willing to project military power abroad while seemingly unable or unwilling to manage basic governance at home. It became a powerful symbol for the opposition. The administration's priorities seemed completely disconnected from the immediate needs and crises facing the country.
So you put all that together, the Insurrection Act threats, the IG firings, the Fed interference, weaponizing the shutdown, the Santos commutation, the VP's comments, the chaotic foreign and economic policies. It paints a pretty clear picture of why 7 million people might feel compelled to take to the streets shouting, "No kings."
It provides that crucial context, yeah. It wasn't just abstract disagreement. It was a reaction to a whole series of specific actions perceived as overreach and mismanagement.
Okay, we absolutely cannot talk about the No Kings protests without deeply understanding the other crisis unfolding at the exact same time, the government shutdown. It was entering its 4th week right as these protests hit their peak.
That timing is critical. It created this intense backdrop of real, tangible hardship and governmental failure against which the protests were happening. You can't separate the two narratives.
A 4-week shutdown. That's
Yep.
long past a minor budget dispute. That's causing serious pain. What were the sources saying about the human impact?
Devastating is probably the right word. Hundreds of thousands of federal workers were furloughed, not getting paid, missed paychecks piling up.
People living paycheck to paycheck suddenly have nothing.
Exactly. The reports highlighted really tough stories, people who consider themselves middle class suddenly having to rely on food banks. And then you had essential workers, think TSA agents at airports, Border Patrol, air traffic controllers required to work, but without pay.
That's an impossible situation, keeping things running out of sheer duty while their own finances collapse.
Pretty much. And the impact spread beyond just federal employees. The court system had to drastically scale back operations.
Yeah.
Justice delayed, huge backlogs building up.
And basic safety net programs.
Under threat, funding was projected to run out very soon for critical programs like SNAP, the food support for low-income families, and for various public health agencies. The most vulnerable people were facing imminent cuts to essential support.
And the overall economic cost. It wasn't trivial.
Not at all. The estimates cited were in the billions of dollars per week being lost to the economy, just hemorrhaging money because of political deadlock.
You could see it on the ground, too, right? Infrastructure projects getting stalled.
Yeah, that was a visible consequence in big cities. Major projects, building new subway lines, repairing bridges, things people rely on every day in places like New York, funding was frozen. So people could literally see the government failing to function, failing to maintain essential infrastructure, while the political arguments raged on.
So let's get into those political mechanics. How is this happening? The sources say Democrats, even though they were the minority in the Senate, were actually the ones holding up a short-term spending bill. How could the minority party do that?
It comes down to the peculiar rules of the Senate. Even as the minority, they have tools. Primarily, the filibuster, or the threat of it, which requires 60 votes to overcome for most legislation.
Not just a simple majority.
Right. And they could also simply refuse to give unanimous consent, which is often needed to speed things up. So by refusing to play ball, by threatening to draw out the process indefinitely, they could effectively block a simple short-term funding extension, what they call a continuing resolution, or CR, unless their demands were met.
They had leverage even without the numbers.
Exactly. It forced the majority Republicans in the administration to negotiate because the alternative was letting the damaging shutdown continue indefinitely.
So what were their demands? What did they need to agree to reopen the government?
They had a couple of key conditions, focused on policy but also on the process itself. First, a policy point. They wanted a bipartisan agreement to deal with expiring health insurance subsidies for low-income Americans under the ACA, a critical issue affecting millions.
Okay, so a specific policy win.
But the second demand was maybe even more fundamental, reflecting that whole no kings context. They demanded that any deal reached be final.
Final. What does that mean in this context? Wasn't a budget deal always supposed to be final?
You'd think so. But their concern, as articulated by figures like Senator Tim Kaine in the sources, was that the administration had shown it was willing to undermine deals after the fact.
How?
Through executive orders, through firing key personnel, through redirecting funds. The fear was, okay, we agree to fund the government, and then tomorrow the president fires another 10,000 federal workers by executive fiat or cancels funding for that bridge project in the Democratic state anyway.
Ah, so they wanted guarantees against that kind of executive end run around the deal.
Exactly. They weren't just negotiating policy. They were trying to negotiate for the reliability of the governing process itself. They wanted safeguards built in, assurance that a deal was actually a deal.
But this strategy, holding out like that, it's incredibly risky for the Democrats too, isn't it?
Hugely risky. They're fighting for what they see as important principles, vital checks on power. But the longer the shutdown dragged on, the more the pain was felt by their constituencies, federal workers, city residents, people relying on social programs.
The very people marching in the streets might start demanding they just make a deal, any deal.
That's the tightrope.
Yeah.
Public opinion polls generally blamed the administration and the Republican majority more for the shutdown itself, but the suffering was real and immediate for many Democratic voters. So leaders were getting hammered from both sides. Stand firm on principle, but also please end the pain. It was a massive test of political will and endurance.
Okay, let's put it all together. 7 million people marching. The government shut down. An unprecedented situation. How did President Trump and the Republican leadership officially react to this massive display of dissent?
The reaction was swift and unambiguous. It was total dismissal mixed with outright contempt.
Examples.
President Trump himself called the protests a joke, said they were very small, very ineffective, which obviously flies in the face of the numbers. He called the participants whacked out.
Dismissing 7 million people as small takes some doing.
It certainly signals a level of disconnect or perhaps a deliberate strategy to project strength by ignoring reality. He also immediately fell back on the claim that they were all paid protesters, funded by Soros and other radical left lunatics, just completely denying any genuine, organic basis for the dissent.
If you believe 7 million people showed up just because George Soros wrote checks. Well, that says a lot about your view of popular movement.
It does. It suggests a belief that power is purely transactional, not ideological or principled. But maybe the ultimate expression of contempt, the most visceral one, came later that day via social media.
What happened?
Trump posted an AI-generated video on his Truth Social platform. It depicted him wearing a crown, a direct mocking reference to the No Kings theme, flying a jet that then appeared to dump, well, sources described it as feces or human waste, onto the images of the protesters below.
Wait, seriously? The president posted a video of himself symbolically defecating on 7 million citizens protesting his policies.
That's what the sources reported. It was seen as just this incredibly raw, aggressive display of contempt, perfectly capturing the, frankly, mutual animosity between the administration and this massive opposition movement.
Unbelievable. And what about the wider Republican leadership? Did they echo this dismissal?
Largely, yes, focusing on the fear narrative they tried to build beforehand. Congressional Republicans kept repeating warnings that the rallies would be hate America events, full of Marxists and Antifa. Attorney General Pam Bondi publicly wondered who was paying the protesters, reinforcing that idea that it couldn't possibly be genuine.
So there's this complete reality gap. The administration predicted chaos and saw paid agitators. The organizers delivered peaceful, massive, diverse crowds focused on the Constitution.
And that successful counter-narrative, that peaceful reality, created what looked like a huge political opportunity for the Democrats and the broader opposition. Even though, as the sources point out, the Democratic Party itself wasn't exactly popular at the time.
Right, their favorability ratings were low.
Yeah, really low. Something like only a third of Americans had a favorable view of the Democratic Party then. So the energy was clearly anti-Trump, anti-administration, but it wasn't necessarily pro-Democrat. Capturing that energy was the challenge.
And did the protesters themselves feel the Democrats were up to the challenge? What was the feeling from the ground about the party leadership?
A lot of frustration, actually. Many attendees quoted in the reports were critical of Democratic leaders, seeing them as too passive, too willing to compromise on core principles, too focused on, quote, the high road.
The high road doesn't work. I saw that quote.
Exactly. There was a palpable feeling that the situation demanded more fight. People wanted the Democrats to throw some more elbows, as one person put it, to be more aggressive in defending democratic norms, not just absorb the attacks.
So the energy's there, the numbers are there, but converting street heat into actual political power is the next step. The DNC chair, Ken Martin, seemed to recognize that.
He did. He explicitly urged the crowds. Showing up is crucial, yes, but the real work is to move the needle and get back some power through the ballot box. And there were immediate tests coming up.
The November elections that year, which ones were seen as the key indicators?
The big ones were the governor's races in Virginia and New Jersey. Virginia was especially key, a swing state that had been trending blue, but the race was competitive. It was seen as a major test. Could this anti-Trump energy translate into the hard work of voter registration, turnout, persuasion needed to win a tight race?
Abigail Spanberger was the Dem candidate there, right?
Yeah, former congresswoman, slightly leading the polls, but it was close. New Jersey's race was also tighter than expected, another chance to measure the administration's standing. These were the immediate barometers.
But the real prize everyone was looking towards was the midterms the following year.
Absolutely. Winning back control of Congress, or at least one chamber, in the next year's midterms, that was seen as the only way to establish a truly effective, formal check on the president's power for the remainder of his term. That was the ultimate goal the protests were building towards.
But here's the catch. The sources also highlight deep divisions within that anti-Trump coalition, right? The unity on the street might not translate easily into unified policy or primary choices.
That's the huge internal challenge. The Stop Trump banner papered over some significant cracks. We saw intense primary battles brewing in states like Maine, Massachusetts, California, Michigan.
What were the fault lines?
Often generational, often ideological. You had older, more establishment Democratic figures facing challenges from younger, more progressive candidates. The fights were over strategy and substance.
Like what? Economic policy versus social issues.
That was a big one. One wing prioritizing kitchen table economic issues, jobs, healthcare costs, infrastructure. Another wing emphasizing social justice issues, more trans rights, climate action, racial equity, a different foreign policy approach, particularly regarding Palestine.
And those foreign policy risks were spilling out into the open, weren't they?
They were. Former VP Kamala Harris had some of her events interrupted by pro-Palestinian protesters. It showed that even within the party leadership, there wasn't consensus on key issues. And that's the problem. Marching against Trump unifies people. Deciding on specific legislation, choosing primary candidates, figuring out the balance between appealing to the base and winning swing voters, that fractures the coalition.
So the path from protest energy to electoral victory is complicated by these internal dynamics.
Very complicated. Push too far left on social issues, you might lose suburban moderates. Be too cautious in establishment, you might demoralize the passionate base that showed up for the marches. It's a classic strategic dilemma for the party.
So if voting is the longer game, what did the organizers like Indivisible plan to do in the immediate aftermath? Just wait for the midterms.
No, they signaled a shift in strategy. Ezra Levin, one of Indivisible's leaders, explicitly said there will be no Kings 3. So more protests were planned.
but with a different focus.
Seemingly, yes. The idea was to move beyond just mass marches. The focus would shift towards actively defending specific institutions that were perceived as being bullied or undermined by the administration, the media, universities, even businesses that spoke out. And pushing for accountability now, through oversight, through legal challenges, through public pressure, not just waiting for the next election. Making resistance a continuous, active part of civic life. Hashtag tag outro.
So when you step back from this deep dive into October 2025, you really see these two incredibly powerful, conflicting narratives playing out. On one side, this absolutely unprecedented wave of popular opposition, 7 million people, remarkably peaceful, incredibly diverse, all saying no kings.
And on the other side, you have this entrenched executive power, seemingly unfazed by the protests, doubling down on its authority, willing to use really high-risk tools like the shutdown, like the threat of military deployment domestically. It's a stark contrast.
The protests themselves, as the sources suggest, were fundamentally trying to restore something basic, weren't they? The conditions for normal democratic disagreement, for checks and balances to actually function.
Exactly. They were pushing back against that perceived drift towards unchecked executive power, towards something that felt more like rule by decree than constitutional governance. They were trying to reassert that foundational American idea.
Which leaves us with a really profound question, especially given the context of that simultaneous government shutdown. We have this massive popular dissent, but you also have an executive demonstrating a willingness to ignore it and use powerful tools to maintain control. The legislature is gridlocked.
Right. Paralyzed by the shutdown and its own internal divisions.
And the courts, while sometimes intervening, are often slow, and their decisions can be seen through a partisan lens anyway. So it forces you to ask, in that specific high-stakes moment, what institution, or perhaps what force, represented the strongest actual check on presidential authority?
That really is the core question emerging from this snapshot in time. Was it the courts, relying on precedent and procedure? Was it Congress, hamstrung as it was? Or was it perhaps the sheer undeniable force of those millions of people in the streets, the protesters themselves, embodying that idea that ultimate sovereignty rests with the people? Figuring out that balance of power, that's what was being contested right there in October 2025. It's a question about whether no kings could transition from a protest cry back into a working principle of American government.